Hi, my name is Madison Franco, and I am the Program Intake Associate at INCLUDEnyc. Today's topic is bodies, curiosity, and touching. So this is one of a series of live stream presentations that are aired on the third Thursday of each month at noon. Today's presentation has been adopted from a series and will run less than 60 minutes. We will use a chat box, so if you have any questions, please feel free to chat us, and we will do our best to answer them. Today's guest is Megan Pamela Ruth Madison, who works with the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute at CUNY. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Should I introduce myself a little?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Megan, as you said. The gender pronouns that feel good to me are she and her and hers. And I am a trainer with the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute. I go around the city and I facilitate workshops for families and for early childhood professionals on gender and sexuality and family diversity. And I got into this work because I'm a preschool teacher by background.
Yes.
I started a little over 10 years ago as an assistant teacher in a Waldorf school in Michigan, where I grew up. And then I got a master's degree in early childhood education and became a lead teacher in a Head Start program in Chicago. And I think that's when I kind of fell in love with the work of early childhood education. And at the same time, I was noticing that the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in my classroom had really big questions and curiosities about the world. They were asking me, what happens when somebody dies? Is there a heaven? They were asking, why do all the janitors and the bus drivers have brown skin and that people call black?
Yeah.
And they were exploring their bodies, including their genitals, and finding different ways to use their bodies, asking me lots of questions about when and how was appropriate to use their bodies.
Yeah.
And even with all my fancy, shiny degrees and certificates, I felt quite unprepared to answer those questions. And so naively, I thought that's what a PhD would be for. And I'm now 8 years into a PhD program at Brandeis University. And I don't have answers to all of the questions, but I do have access to lots of children's books and resources and research, and that's kind of what brings me to this work.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, as most of you know, I am the parent of a 4-year-old named Julian who has a disability. So Julian is a character, I guess you would say, for, the most appropriate use of a word. He's very curious about everything, including his sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually lucky enough to take one of Megan's workshops. So throughout the live stream today, I'll just be giving some examples of some of the things that we've done and some of the way that things have worked for us and some of the funny questions that I've gotten from him, because I usually say the best way to learn is through examples, so I will try my best to give you guys as many examples as I can. So there's a lot to learn today, and our goal is to reflect on and deconstruct parents' feelings about children's curiosity and sexual exploration. We will talk about strategies for fostering children's comfort about sexuality and their bodies while setting limits, and to help children develop a sense of boundaries. So sexuality can be an emotional subject.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that I wanted to ask is, how would you define sexuality?
What a great place to start. How do we define sexuality? Especially because, when I first started this work, and still to this day, often people are like, sexuality, young children, those two concepts don't belong together in one sentence. And I think people feel that way because we often define sexuality as being just about sex or just about sexual intercourse. And of course, when we're talking about young children and sexuality, we're not talking about sexual intercourse. Yeah. So then the question is, what are we talking about? And at the Early Childhood Professional Development Institute, we define sexuality as being about our bodies, our genders, our relationships, our feelings, and our sense of closeness, intimacy, love, and care with other people, including our caregivers and our friends. And when we think about sexuality in that way, it makes a lot of sense and feels very appropriate for young children, because we know that young children have bodies, they have relationships, that they experience emotions, and are navigating how to control those emotions and express those emotions in the world.
And it kind of ties into almost every aspect of their development.
Mm-hmm.
So it's natural, it's normal.
Yes, definitely.
So what does healthy sexuality and healthy sexual development look like?
Well, kind of building off what you were saying, that it ties into every facet of a young child's development. We can kind of think about, like, if we break it down in terms of the typical domains, we've got social development, cognitive development, physical development, emotional development. We can kind of break down sexuality in terms of all 4 of those domains. So in terms of physical development, a lot of what it looks like in early childhood education is thinking about how young children are exploring their bodies and what they do. Everything from when they first discover that they have a hand in infancy and stare at it and move their fingers around and get so excited. They're also exploring their penis or their vagina or like different parts of their body and the bodies of others. And they're just curious about, what's that called? How does it work? What function does it play?
Yeah.
In terms of their cognitive development, they're really curious and asking lots of questions, like, where do babies come from? Or how does, I get that the baby's in there, but how does the baby get out, right?
Yeah, which is a great question to ask.
It
makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, yeah. It's about their emotional development, so learning to develop healthy relationships and express their feelings and name their feelings with other people, and about their social development. So navigating new friendships, for example, when they enter preschool for the first time.
Yeah, and I know for me, with my son Julian, it's like he discovered that you poop from your butt, and this was like the biggest thing for him.
Yeah.
And I use it as like one of those teachable moments where it's like, yeah, babe, you eat food and it goes through your body and you digest it and you have all of these different organs that help you digest it. And then you kind of poop it out.
Mm-hmm.
So for him now, he's like, oh, Mom, I'm eating spaghetti, and then I'm going to poop it out, and this is great. I'm so excited.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, it was kind of like a way to teach him other things and help him along his development and get him to understand the way things work. So for me, it's like just very interesting to see the different types of connections that he makes when it comes to things like that.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great example, because it's both about cognitive development, like learning about nutrition and how our bodies work and what does it mean when we eat something and then it goes down into our digestive system, and like what a cool new word to learn, digestive system, and then how does it leave our bodies, but also about like developing a sense of ownership and empowerment over our own bodies, right? Like I imagine Julian's like, now that he knows how his own body works, like there's a sense of excitement that comes from that.
Yes.
Like, oh wow, like look at this. Like I know about my body. I know how it works.
Yeah, I mean, for potty training, we used it too. So it's just like, well, if you want to see what it looks like when it comes out, you got to use the toilet so you can see it. And now it's kind of like, okay, I will. But before it was like kind of lenient, like, oh, I don't know, I'm weird. But the more conversations, the easier it's been for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it reminds me too of, have you ever read the book Everybody Poops?
No, I haven't.
It's kind of a classic. I brought lots of books today. Unfortunately, I forgot to bring that one. But you could probably find it at any New York City public library.
Nice.
And it's a classic because it just kind of normalizes, like, everybody poops. It's not
Which
something...
is true.
It's just true. Mm-hmm.
So, how is adult sexuality different from child sexuality?
Great question. So, and I think folks have a handout, right? That was available to people?
So everyone has a handout.
Okay. So there's a slide that goes along with this. And just as some reference, we use this kind of as our guiding text. I don't know if it's currently in print, but it's available online. It's called Healthy Sexuality Development, a Guide for Early Childhood Educators and Families. And I think it's really helpful because they kind of outline 3 main ways that adult sexuality differs from children's sexuality. And the first is that children are curious and playful.
Yeah.
Exactly like the stories.
Innocent, beautiful.
Yes, exactly. We also know that children are as spontaneous and open about sex as they are about everything else, right? Yes. And so that excitement over, oh my gosh, I'm going to eat spaghetti and then poop it out, might come up in line at the grocery store or at dinner, at a fancy dinner party, right?
Which it does.
Yes.
All the time.
And I kind of like especially those first 2 characteristics because I think there's a lot as grown-ups that we can actually learn from young children's openness and curiosity and spontaneity around sexuality. And then the third important difference is that children find the topic of sexuality at the same time really exciting and also maybe kind of disgusting. And so we see that a lot, like in the jokes, for example.
Yeah.
Like it's very typical for 4-year-olds to tell poop jokes a lot.
Yes.
Yes,
One,
because they notice that like grown-ups react to them, but also it's kind of playing with that, like really curious, but also like, there's something kind of gross about this that they're interested in.
And 4-year-olds love gross stuff.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Totally makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we help children learn to talk about and feel comfortable about their bodies?
So many ways. I think one way I've been thinking about a lot is modeling talking about our own bodies in a way that's comfortable and without shame. And so talking about, like, when I go out for a run, coming back and talking about, like, wow, like, isn't it so cool that I have these strong legs that help me run really far?
Yeah.
I think, like, there are little ways often as grown-ups that we talk about our bodies in not so positive and comfortable ways.
Yeah. We're all guilty of it, too.
Right? Like, it's so ingrained, and young children are watching us, right? And so if they see us thinking about our bodies in that way, it's likely that they'll also internalize those messages. What are some ways that you talk about and foster bodily comfort with Julian?
So one of the things that I do with Julian is, like, if I buy new clothes, I usually try them on. And for some reason, he really likes it, which I find kind of funny and sweet at the same time. So I'll try things on and I'll ask him how I look. And his response is, oh, Mommy, you look beautiful. Oh, Mommy, I love when you wear blue. It looks so great on you. And I'm like, okay, babe. Do you think, like, if it's a dress, do you think it's short or is it long enough? Do you see too much of my legs? And he's like, Mommy, I love your legs. They're great. I'm like, oh, baby, I love your legs. They're great and they're strong and you use them to move. And he's like, Mom, I run all the time with my legs. And it's like, I'm so excited. So for me, I'm like, yes, babe, that's amazing. Or when he eats his food, like, he'll show me his stomach and his stomach is, like, really round. And he's like, Mom, I ate all the food and I'm so full. Look at my belly. And I'm like, oh, babe, you have the cutest belly ever. And I love it. And I'm so happy that you ate your food. And he's like, yep, gonna poop it out. Yep, I know. So for him, it always kind of goes back to it. Or like with his hair. He really likes to have his hair long. But he doesn't like to necessarily wash or like comb his hair. So I always remind him, you know, even though your hair is not long and your hair is short, it's still beautiful. And it's curly like Mommy's, and it's blonde like the sun, and it's so nice. And he's like, oh, Mommy, I love my hair. And I'm like, yeah, babe, I love your hair too. So it's like I usually just try to find moments where I kind of feel like maybe he may have that, like that self-doubt or like something that may come in to make him feel bad about it. And I just try to tell him how much I love it and how great I think it is, and I try to compare it to something else that I know that he thinks is amazing.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
It reminds me of some of the books I brought.
Awesome.
So one book I love for talking about hair, especially for young black girls, is called Princess Hair. There's lots of other great books, but it's a way of, especially during Black History Month, like honoring that there are societal messages that kids are already picking up about what good bodies or bodies are supposed to look like, what hair is supposed to look like, what princess hair is supposed to look like. And so using books like this is a way of kind of pushing back on that and saying, actually, no, there's lots of different ways for a princess's hair to look.
Yeah, which is great. We're all different, and it's great that these books can show kids that we're all different and we're all beautiful at the same time.
Yeah. Or even books with like infants and toddlers is a great opportunity to start talking about the different parts of our body. So one of my favorites is Whose Toes Are Those? Which it's super sweet, right? And it's like a beautiful little infant toddler book that talks about toes. Or Pretty Brown Face is another really sweet one that talks about all the different parts of your face. Eyes, nose, mouth, and then it ends with a mirror. So you can sit with your infant and talk about the parts of their face. And I think kind of building off of that, we often get comfortable talking about legs and toes and hair, but then the second we start talking about genitalia, we start talking about penises and vaginas, it gets uncomfortable, right? We might whisper those words or avoid talking about those parts of our body altogether, or use pet names for those parts of our body. And one thing we really advocate is to use like accurate terminology and empower young children to know those names. Even if you choose to use a different word for a penis or a vagina, for example, at home, making sure that your young child knows that a lot of people call it a penis or call it a vagina can be really empowering because if we say head and shoulders, knees and toes, and we use those words calmly, if we talk about penis and all of a sudden we're like, penis, right? Like it unintentionally sends a message that that's a part of our body that we should be ashamed of or is too taboo to talk about.
Yeah. And I mean, that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's called. It's a penis, it's a vagina. Since I took your workshop, I'm actually very open with Julian, and we call a penis, a vagina is vagina. I get lots of weird questions at times, which are usually kind of funny. I usually try to answer them to the best of my ability. But one thing that he did that I thought was pretty interesting is one morning we were at a bus stop and he asked me, he told me, Mom, I have a penis. And I was like, yeah, baby, I have a penis. And this is like a bus stop with like 20 people around us. It's like 8 o'clock in the morning. Everybody can hear us. And I'm just like, all right, let's do this. Like, I got this. And he's like, Mom, do you have a vagina? And I was like, yeah, I have a vagina. He's like, you know what, Mom? I think you have a penis and a vagina. And I'm like, okay, baby. And he's like, Mom, because you do everything. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, baby, that makes sense. And I do a lot of things. But I also only have a vagina. And maybe sometimes people do have a penis and vagina, but Mommy only has the vagina. And thank you for noticing all of the things that I do, but everybody can do everything. So for me, it was kind of like, oh, you know what? He's asking me these questions, but he's also relating it to all of the things that we do every day. And he's also making other connections that I think maybe I wouldn't have noticed if I wouldn't have used the proper wording with him and have that open space where we can just conversate about different things.
Right. What a beautiful story, because it highlights so many, like, strengths and strategies.
Yeah. I think he's great.
But it sounds like you're pretty great too, right?
I try. I'm definitely not perfect, but I definitely try as much as I can to be open-minded.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the things I hear in that story are, first, you've created an open conversation with Julian. So he felt comfortable asking you questions and sharing with you his hypotheses, his theories about bodies and about gender, right? And that doesn't just happen overnight. That means you've done some personal work to feel comfortable using that terminology, and you've kind of laid the foundation so that he feels comfortable having that conversation with you. Two, in the moment, even though I could even see you took a deep breath right when he answered it, and you're like, okay.
A second of bracing yourself, okay.
I'm ready for this, right?
Yeah.
So that's a great strategy in and of itself. And I think another beautiful thing that came out in that story is just illustrating that already young children are they have ideas about gender and about bodies and the relationship between gender and bodies and our gendered roles in society, what we should be doing based on our gender. And so because you had laid that foundation to have an open conversation with him, you then could start diving into that conversation and either correcting misinformation he had or just opening a conversation to help him start understanding that actually you're right. In society, a lot of people think girls can only do some things and boys can only do some things. Yeah. But actually, girls and boys can do all kinds of different things. Yeah,
and that's one thing that we're very open about. I always tell him, anybody can do anything, and you can do whatever you want to do. And at home, we have a kitchen, he has baby dolls, he has carriages, and I kind of just let him explore and play with everything that he wants to. And sometimes I do get people who are sometimes like, oh, well, he shouldn't be playing with the carriage, he shouldn't be doing this, and my response is always, well, eventually one day he may be a dad, and this is just pretty much preparing him for that. Teaching him how to carry a baby and that. When you put the baby in the carriage, you have to buckle them in. And when you're feeding the baby, you should burp the baby after. And to me, it's just giving him a better understanding of the world, of how everything works, and just not one-sided, a one-sided picture of it.
Great.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you is, why is it so important for us, especially for kids with disabilities, to use correct terminology when speaking about their body parts?
So many reasons. I think one reason, and this is hard to talk about because as an early childhood educator, one of the only conversations, some of the only training I got around early childhood sexuality was mandated reporter training. Yeah. Or, in other words, the conversation around sexuality development for young children was only focused on preventing sexual abuse of young children. And so I think because of that, and I know I'm not the only early childhood educator who's had that experience, and kind of because of that larger context, then a lot of us hold a lot of fear around talking about healthy sexuality development because we have this automatic association between early childhood sexuality and sexual abuse. There's just a whole lot more to this conversation than just sexual abuse prevention.
Yeah. So,
that being said, it is important to talk about sexual abuse prevention, right? And especially with kids with disabilities, we know the research says that young children with disabilities are about 3 times more likely to be at risk of sexual abuse. And so when we empower young children with accurate terminology, it's one preventative strategy to making sure that all children are safe and healthy and taken care of.
And I also learned in your workshop too that when in those situations of abuse, when the children know the correct terminology, it's more likely that they'll actually be believed in those situations. And I feel like that's something very powerful for them. I mean, and we should believe kids regardless, but giving them the power to understand, like, this is my penis and someone touched it and I'm uncomfortable is definitely just empowering them as a whole. And I think it's a great thing for us to do. So my next... Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's just such an important topic,
Yeah.
I think it's... so when young children know the names of all their parts of their body, they're more likely to feel empowered and, know that their body is theirs. They can talk about it with confidence. They're also more likely then to report abuse if it happens, and they're also more likely to be believed, exactly like you said, in part because grown-ups will know what kids are talking about.
So how is normal curiosity different from signs of abuse?
Good question. So the first thing to know is that the research says that behavior like masturbation or sexual play in early childhood is very common. So, for example, there's one study that was done by UCLA that found 3/4 of families, over 75% of families, reported their child engaging in some sort of play or masturbation prior to age 6. So it's very common and not always a warning sign. But if you are worried about, how do I differentiate what's typical from a warning sign? What's typical is usually, they say, transient and easily distractible. So it'll happen for a while. A child will be really curious about a particular behavior, how it feels, but it won't last for, months and months and months and months. They'll go through a phase. And also it will be distractible. So it'll be a thing they're interested in, but if they also really like cars and you say, hey, do you want to play cars instead of masturbate? They'll go, oh, okay, I can do that.
I like cars, it's cool.
I like cars, right. Warning signs, on the other hand, you might be you might want to dig deeper and ask yourself what's going on. If there's coercion involved, so it's play between 2 children and one child clearly does not want to engage and another child is coercing a child, we are going to look out for coercion. We want to look out for injurious behavior. So if a child is doing something that's hurting themselves or hurting another child, that might be a warning sign. Or it's so persistent and intrusive that it can't be distracted. And again, even if you see those warning signs, it's not cause for immediate alarm. It's just cause for, that's when you want to reach out and phone a friend. You want to ask a social worker. You want to ask a case manager. Yeah, you want to ask your doctor.
Yeah, definitely. That's great advice. So the next question that I wanted to ask you is, how can we teach children to talk about and think about their bodies without feeling shame?
Good question. And we talked about this a little bit, right?
Yes.
Let me see if there's anything else in my notes that will be helpful. I think, what did we say? We talked about modeling feeling good about our own bodies. We talked about empowering children with language about all their parts of their bodies. We talked about, what other ways to avoid feeling shame? Oh, in those moments when we're feeling an instinct to hush or we're feeling embarrassed ourselves, those are moments when we as grown-ups can kind of take a deep breath and pause and avoid that instinct. Or if we kind of anticipate that it's going to come up, for example, I didn't grow up in a home where we said words like penis and vagina.
Me either.
Openly, right? And so in order to get to that place, I just had to practice.
Yeah.
I remember once I was asked to give this workshop at the mayor's office. And I was like, wow, I've gotten used to doing this workshop like in a tiny little room with 20 early childhood educators, but the mayor's office, I'm supposed to go to the mayor's office and say penis. Like, in order to do this workshop, I have to say penis like 30 times. So I was like, oh, what am I going to do? And I asked my partner, and he said, well, how about you just practice? And so I stood in the bathroom mirror, and I just said penis, 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 30 times until I could say it without blushing. And so practice really does help.
No, it does. I remember when I first came home from the workshop, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this, and he's going to ask me questions, and I'm going to answer. And it was like, the first question he asked me, I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, so that's your penis. And I remember just feeling like, I guess, so embarrassed, and like my face turning red. And it's just, now I'm just like, yeah, babe, that's your penis. You know that, right? He's like, yeah, Mom, it's my penis. Or like, Mom, I woke up and my penis is big. And I'm like, yeah, babe, you know, sometimes in the morning your penis is big. After you pee, you'll be fine. And he'll pee and he comes back and he's like, oh, Mom, I'm fine. And I'm like, great, babe. He's like, all right, I'm going to get dressed. And it's like, okay. And now it's just become something where it's just like he talks about it and in 2 seconds he's completely over it. Where I kind of felt like if we weren't so open, it would be more questions. And then it kind of adds that thing, well, if I can't talk about it openly, then maybe it's bad, and maybe it's not something that we should talk about, and maybe it's not something that I should do. So with him, I just try to be as open as possible. Or like even in the situations where he's curious and he kind of wants to explore himself, I kind of usually tell him, well, baby, you know, sometimes when you do that in front of Mommy, it makes Mommy feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I think that if you go to the room by yourself and you want to do it, it's no problem. You can be curious. It's part of your body, and you want to know what it's like. And he's like, yeah, Mom, it's my penis. I usually laugh at that point because he's very serious. Like, it's my penis. Like, come on,
it's his
Mom.
body. Yeah, he knows.
Which I think is great because it's like that ownership is totally there for him. So for him, it's like, okay, babe, well, you know, in the room by yourself. So just going off of that, my next question to you would be, you know, when we talk about touching, masturbation, and self-soothing, what would you say would be a good idea, like for place and time, or maybe like public and private? What would be your, I guess, your interpretation or your advice when it comes to that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first one is, again, like, take a deep breath and, like, manage our own emotional reactions as grown-ups. Because when we freak out, it sends a message to young children, and usually that message is shame, and we really want to avoid instilling shame. And then 2, recognize that it's really typical, that like most young children explore their bodies, and touching certain parts of their bodies bring pleasure. And so, like, okay, great, like, it's pretty typical. And then I really love this idea of there's a certain place and time where things are appropriate. And that kind of gets to this idea of, like, setting limits without shaming. Sometimes when we use, like, that's a public thing versus a private thing, unintentionally we still, like, private things have this connotation of being shameful. So, and young children they're becoming part of the social world, right? They're, like, understanding society in a way for the first time, and, like, what are some kind of cultural norms. And so it kind of falls in line with what young children are already kind of grappling with, in terms of there's a certain place and time for certain behaviors. We pee and poop in the bathroom. We eat in our classroom or in our family. We eat sitting at a table using a fork and a knife. We touch our genitals, or we masturbate in our bedrooms before bed, for example. The boundaries, like, there's no right and wrong when it comes to the boundaries. It's every family gets to make their own choices about what works for them. But the key thing is just kind of like setting those limits in a calm way and explaining why those boundaries exist.
So how will creating these open conversations build trust at a young age and help children feel more comfortable in talking to their parents while building the basis for strong relationships? So how does having all of these open and honest conversations help them along the way with building trust with their parents, feeling open with their parents, but then also in their future relationships as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think I am not a parent yet, but from the stories I've heard from parents like you and other parents who are friends, especially as kids get older and their questions around sexuality get more and more complicated, I think there's often a sense of like, wow, I really want them to feel like they can come to me with anything that comes up. And I think in this work, it just feels like such a great opportunity because it's like we can lay the foundation for that open communication and that trusting, healthy relationship really, really early on. So you don't have to play catch up later on. Like from a very early age, your kids are feeling like my grown-up is a person I can go to with questions about my body, about my relationships, about my feelings. And it's not going to be full of shame. It's not going to be full of embarrassment. My parent might not always have all of the answers, but they're open to maybe going to the library and finding a book and figuring out the answers to those questions together.
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely agree. I feel like since I've been having more open conversations with Julian, I've noticed that he's more comfortable in asking me about everything. So it can be things to, like sometimes he'll ask me, Mom, how does the train work? And why does it run on the tracks? And does it need tracks in order for it to run? And why are all the people on the train? And where are they going? And then it's like, well, Mom, there's different types of people. And some men are big and some men are little. So does that mean that some men have big penises and some men have little penises? And it's like, yeah, well, baby, everybody's different. Everybody's different. The way they look are different. My hands are bigger than your hands, but your hands might be bigger than someone else's. Or, your eyes are green, but my eyes are brown, and they're different, but both of our eyes are beautiful. So it's like it really just opens up for him to just be able to ask me all of the different questions because he knows that I'll either try to answer if I tell him, like, you know what, babe, I have no idea. He's like, okay. And then sometimes he'll bring it back up, or sometimes I'll be like, babe, I'll check, and then when we get home, I'll answer. But I usually try to make sure that when I get home, I answer. But I noticed for him, it definitely has made us closer. And it definitely has, I guess, even opened up my perception to it. Because it's kind of like as adults, we see everything on like this straight line. And it's like in talking to him and working with him and just doing all of the things that I do with him. It's like it's given me like this 360 view where I see things a little bit differently. So usually what I tell my parents, especially at workshops, is, kids are just like adults. They think the way we do. They react the way we do. They are way more perceptive than what we actually give them credit for. They're just in littler bodies where they're learning the way things work and they don't have the authority that we do. So it's like they can't just do everything that they want to. There's boundaries for them, but we need to help them understand what those boundaries actually are. And we need for them to trust us enough to know that we're going to lead them in the right direction.
Beautifully put.
So the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm sure everybody wants to know about, is how should we answer questions when asked by children?
So I think step one, validate the curiosity. Like whether you're prepared to answer the question or not, you can always start with like, wow, that is a really good question. Thank you for asking me. I think it's also important to know that you don't have to know the answers to all of the questions. So sometimes you can say exactly like you did, like, that's a really good question. I don't know. Let's look it up, or I'll get back to you. And just like you said, like when you promise to get back, you have to get back. You can't just hope they don't remember. And if your first instinct is to get embarrassed, that's when practicing comes in. But I think the key is really just being honest, like providing accurate, age-appropriate answers to their questions. And I think sometimes we are afraid that, like, if we open this door, it's going to lead us down a road that I'm not totally sure as a grown-up that I'm ready to go down. But oftentimes, if we just answer the question, like, sometimes it takes a little bit of inquiry. Like, can you tell me what you mean by that? To really get underneath what they're asking. But once we really understand what they're asking and we answer it, usually they're like, okay, cool. Moving on.
Yeah, I get that all the time. I'm nervous, and he's like, and I give him the answer, and he's like, all right, bye. And I'm like, my heart is beating, my face is red, and he's just like, all right, Mom, that's fine. So we have a really great question from one of our viewers. It says, when helping with bath time, my daughter would touch her baby brother's penis out of curiosity. Should I discourage this because it's his private part, set boundaries? How would you use an open dialogue about differences between male and female?
What a great question. Okay, so there's a couple different parts. So it sounds like there's an interest in like learning about boundaries and kind of helping this older child understand that not everybody wants them to touch your penis. And so even if baby brother, and it also is an opportunity, it sounds like, if baby brother's young enough where he can't say himself, like, I don't like that, an opportunity to talk about consent, right? Because you can just say, like, you know, oh, I noticed you're curious. I don't know if baby brother wants that, and he's too little to tell us if he likes it or he doesn't like it, and so we're not going to do that. What else can we do to, like, satisfy your curiosity? And if they're curious about what a penis looks like, you can go to the library, find a book, and answer that question. And again, like, setting those limits without shaming, right? So you can validate the curiosity and also learn to set boundaries. If baby brother is a little bit older and he doesn't seem to mind, like, sometimes the behavior, like, you can actually kind of just let it go. And, like, once the curiosity is, like, satisfied, after that one bath time or a couple bath times, like, the behavior will go away and you don't really have to worry about it. Like, sometimes it's us, it's grown-ups, that are like, ah! Like, I don't know what to do.
We freak out.
We freak out. Like, sometimes if you take a beat, it, like, turns out to be less of a big issue than we thought about. And then there's a last part to that question about gender.
So this is actually another question.
Okay.
I can go into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I want my child to be more comfortable with gender fluidity. How can I help my family outside the home embrace that?
That's such a
Great question.
Yeah, and it connects to, I think there was like a part 2 of the previous question. Is it possible to scroll back? Yeah, how would you use this to open a dialogue about the differences between male and female? And so one thing that's helpful, some language that's helpful for me, is explaining to kids the difference between sex assigned at birth and our gender identity. And as grown-ups, when we haven't been familiar with that language, it feels like, oh my gosh, this is a big concept. But, like, actually it's pretty simple. You can just say that, like, when babies are born, doctors look at their bodies and they make a guess about what the baby's going to be. And usually, if the doctor sees a penis, they say this is going to be a boy or it's male. And usually, when the doctor sees a vagina or a vulva, they make a guess and they say this is going to be a girl. Sometimes those guesses are right, and sometimes those guesses are wrong. So we don't actually know if somebody is a girl or a boy by looking at their bodies. We know if somebody is a girl or a boy or something else, because it turns out there's not even only 2 options. There's lots of different options. We know who someone is by asking them and listening to them and believing them. So if somebody says they're a boy, they're a boy. If somebody says they're a girl, they're a girl.
I think the beautiful thing about kids is kind of like they're totally open to things like that. So it's just like if somebody says they're a boy, kids are just like, all right. No other questions asked, complete acceptance. And it's like, well, he said he's a boy, so he's a boy. So I think that's one of the things that are great about kids is that they're so open and understanding. And we as parents and adults and everybody who's around kids, pretty much in general, we really need to think about, you know, our reactions to things and the way that we speak about different things and the way that we accept or even don't accept things are pretty much modeling for them what to do as they grow as adults because they're learning from us. But to me, I think kids are pretty accepting just to begin with when it comes down to it, and they learn a lot of those behaviors from us. So we should just really be mindful of how we react to things and the way that we approach things.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just a tiny difference in language, right? Like, I grew up with girls have vaginas, boys have penises, and now it's just some bodies have vaginas, some bodies have penises, right? And then if we're like, well, it's just a tiny difference in language, but it creates a lot of room so that as they get older, there's room for more conversations around gender expansiveness and gender fluidity.
Yeah. So one of the things that I feel like is worth mentioning, I know that, especially for our kids with disabilities that are nonverbal, I remember when Julian was nonverbal, he was very curious, but he didn't necessarily have the words to express that he was curious. So I had lots of instances where he would be looking up skirts, or like even with my female friends, he would kind of look or like rub their leg or something. And at the time, I didn't realize it was because he was curious. But now I've noticed that as he's asking more questions and saying more things, that I really don't get that behavior anymore. So it's a big difference from them being able to ask to have the words in order to ask, as opposed to not being able to. So for me, it's kind of also important for parents of children who are nonverbal to be mindful as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes what we think is bad behavior or something that they shouldn't be doing may not be something that's I guess maybe wrong intentionally, because it's not really wrong to be curious, but it's more curiosity, but them not being able to express it verbally.
Yep, that's such a good point. It reminds me of, I was working with a young child, I think he was 4 at the time, and he kept bumping into me. I was just like, what is this? You know, like, and he was verbal at the time, but I don't think he had already at 4 picked up the idea that we don't talk about issues of gender and sexuality openly. And so he kept bumping into me and bumping into me and bumping into me. And finally I was like, something's going on. He's curious about something.
Yeah.
And so I just asked him, you know, like, hey, I'm wondering, why are you bumping into me? And he got a little red in the face and he said, well, I want to know if there's a baby in there. And I was like, oh. He was curious about whether I was pregnant or not, and he knew I had gotten married a couple of years before, and he had kind of picked up a pattern that, like, lots of the women he knew in his life that were around my age and who were married, like, usually got pregnant and had babies. And so I was like, oh, yeah, no, I don't have a baby in there, but are you curious about pregnancy? And he was like, yeah, I am really curious, right? And we are lucky to live in a time when there's lots of great resources. Yes. So a book I really love is called What Makes a Baby, that really answers in an accurate and age-appropriate way how babies are made, but also doesn't go into sexual intercourse, and is written in a way that's, like, really open to all the different ways that families make babies. So one example is the page where it talks about when grown-ups want to make a baby, they need to get an egg from one body and a sperm from another body. So it's written in a really gender-open way. They also need a place where the baby can grow. And then on the next page, it actually has a really great illustration of a uterus, right? Which just
the colors are awesome.
And the colors are awesome. The illustrations are good. It says, you might think that everyone has a uterus, since it has the words you and us in it, but not everyone has a uterus, right? So some bodies have uteruses, some bodies don't.
Yeah. It's a great way to teach acceptance, too.
Yeah. And then the authors have a follow-up book, which is helpful for kids who are a little bit older, called Sex is a Funny Word. And I love this one because it kind of builds off of that initial conversation. But again, it, like, uses, there's whole pages where there's illustrations of what different vaginas look like or different penises look like. So that's really helpful when a kid's really curious about what a vagina looks like, for example. Yeah. But it's not like you will... I mean, some people feel comfortable, but many families don't feel comfortable sharing their own vagina with their child or letting their child look up the skirts of random women at the grocery store. So how do you satisfy that curiosity? You can use a book like this and as a resource.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to go back to talking about ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we give children the tools to feel ownership of their bodies? And then how can we use that ownership to talk about respect and consent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is what we've already been talking about, which is, like, talking about the language that we are the bosses of our own bodies, and empowering children with the names for all of the different parts of their bodies. But then beyond just talking about it, we actually have to show them. Right? We have to model for them what it looks like for us to have ownership over our bodies and for them to have ownership of their own bodies. And so part of that looks like for us as grown-ups doing what you're already doing with Julian, which is, like, setting our own boundaries and saying, this is what's okay. Like, you can climb on me when we're at the park, but when I'm home watching TV, I actually don't want to get climbed on. And that doesn't feel good to my body. And it's okay as a grown-up to set boundaries around your body.
It's okay to say, I don't feel like being jungle gym right now.
Yes. It is 100% okay to say that. And then also creating the space for kids to be the bosses of their bodies when and if it's appropriate. Sometimes if a child is running into the street, for example, there is a boundary as a grown-up, and you can say, actually, I as a grown-up, and it's my job to keep you safe, I can't let you run into the street, and so I'm going to pick you up and give you a hug and bring you back onto the sidewalk. Yeah. But there's lots of opportunities when kids can be the bosses of their bodies, and there's really no reason for us as grown-ups to be setting boundaries. And there's lots of wiggle room in between, too, right? So, like, if we know we're going to get from the house to the car because we're going to grandma's house, we can give options. Do you want to skip to the car? Do you want to run to the car? Do you want to walk slowly like cheetahs to the car?
Race to the car.
Race to the car, right? Like, we know we're going to get to the car one way or the other, but providing opportunities and choice for kids to make decisions about how they want to use their bodies is a really great way to do that.
Yeah. So one thing that I do with Julian is when we meet new people or we go visit family or we go to a party, it is always up to him whether or not he wants to give a kiss, if he wants to give a hug. If he doesn't want to, I don't force him. I usually tell everybody, well, you know, if you want to hug him, I would appreciate if you asked first.
That's great.
Because, you know, when he's at school and he's with other people, I make him ask. Because we talk about not everybody always wants to be hugged. Not everybody wants to be touched. He's a kid who loves to hug, but doesn't like when you hug him. So he's very free with giving you hugs, but when you come to him, he's just like, no, thank you. And he does it to me. And I mean, in the beginning, I was just, oh my God, you don't want to hug me? Like, I can't believe my baby doesn't want to hug me. And now I'm just kind of like, well, okay, babe, you don't want to hug, that's fine. But for him, it's like, he definitely has that sense of ownership where it's just like, no, I don't want to hug you. And it's okay. And I feel like that for him is like this big decision that he can make that sometimes we may take for granted. That is just really up to him. And it also makes me feel too like it gives him the opportunity to understand that when he says no, it can absolutely be no. And it's not where, well, I said no, but you know, mom said I have to. Sometimes there's some situations where I might say no, but I have to. So for us, it's like I really try to put it across that, you know, you said no, so it's no, and you just don't have to. But I also try to put the boundaries in the sense as well, you know, when you're at school, you have to listen. And doing schoolwork and learning is different than someone giving you a hug when you don't want it. And that's a situation where you have to listen because you want to learn and you want to be smart. And you have all of these questions, and when you're in school, it helps answer a lot of those questions. So for us, it kind of ties into almost everything that we do in almost every aspect, as you were saying before, of his development.
That's so great, right? Like helping him understand what are rules, what are things that we have to do, whether we want to do them or not, and what our preference is, and giving him the space, like for example, of whether he wants to give hugs or receive hugs. Like it's already so clear that because you've given him the space to kind of think about what his preferences are and what he likes and what he doesn't like, he's able to articulate that with a degree of nuance that's pretty sophisticated, right? Like, I like to give, but I don't like to receive. That's beautiful. And, like, him being in touch with his own needs and preferences in such a deep way is going to serve him for the rest of his life.
I mean, it's a conversation that we have, especially for kids with disabilities. A lot of times they're unable to read facial expressions or even body language. So with him, we're very verbal. Me and Julian are the same in the sense that I'm not a very big hugger, except he likes to hug, but I just don't hug. I don't really like to be hugged. So with him, it's kind of like, Mommy, can I hug you? And I usually give it even if I don't want to, because of course it's my baby. But for me, the fact that he knows, like, Mom, can I hug you? That he'll ask first, for me is cool. So even as parents, we can set boundaries with kids. And for him, if he does something and I'm frustrated, I'm very verbal when I say that I'm frustrated. And it's like, well, Julian, I'm very frustrated because you did this. Or, you know, Julian, when you're sitting next to me and you take your penis out and you touch it, I feel very uncomfortable. Like, these are the things that I try to help him to understand. Since he has a disability, he may not be able to get it from my face, but he understands what frustrated and uncomfortable means. So sometimes when I'm home and I'm trying to hug up on him and kiss him, he's like, Mommy, I told you I don't want to kiss, and you're making me feel very frustrated. And it's like, all right, babe, I'm sorry, you're frustrated, I won't kiss you. But at 4 years old, and to have a disability and to be able to tell me, you know what, I said no and I'm frustrated, for me is like a huge deal. Like, I'm just like, yes, okay, you got it, no problem.
That's so great. And it also highlights, like, how consent is nuanced. Right? Like, I mean, it's also very clear, no means no, and yes, an enthusiastic yes means yes. And there's lots of ways that we communicate, right? Not just verbally. And young children are capable, right? Like, we often see them reach out their arms to give their friend a hug and then just, like, pause a second and, like, wait to see their other friend put their arms out like this. And then it's like, okay, non-verbally we're signaling, we both want a hug, right? But if you put your arms out like this and your friend goes, maybe that's a non-verbal signal that they're not comfortable with the hug.
Yeah.
And then if nonverbals aren't the thing that's going to work for you, like empowering kids with verbal ways to communicate explicitly what they're interested in and what they're not interested in. That's so great.
Yeah. And I mean, if they don't want to hug, there's other ways that we can go about it too. High fives.
Yes.
Waves. There are so many other things that you can do while respecting someone else's boundaries.
Yes. That reminds me. Another one of my favorite books, Benny Doesn't Like to Be Hugged by Zetta Elliott. And this is a book about an autistic child, Benny, and it talks about all the things that Benny likes to do. So, for example, Benny likes cupcakes that aren't covered in sprinkles. Benny likes clothes that don't have any wrinkles. It rhymes, which is pretty sweet. And also the illustrations are great. Benny can name the brightest star, and he knows why it twinkles. But Benny doesn't like to be hugged. Pretty simple message, but then I love how the illustration provides an alternative, right?
Yeah.
Like Benny's giving his soccer coach a high five instead of a hug because that feels better to him.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question
Great.
from one of our audience members. It says, a special needs school notified the parents that their child was touching himself. What can a parent do to work with the school to recognize that this is a common behavior and not something that needs to be fixed?
Great. What a good question. So, as we kind of mentioned, a lot of early childhood professionals don't currently have access to this kind of training. And so it would make sense that the school or the teachers might be alarmed because they don't have access to this information. So a couple things that it sounds like this family is already taking on an advocacy stance. They're trying to figure out how they're going to intervene. So first is congratulate yourself. You're doing the right thing. You're proactively seeking out good information. You know that you have a right and are empowered to talk with the school and provide this information and help the school be responsive to your particular child's needs. And some resources that might be helpful are in the resources we provided one handout that has kind of typical sexuality development for young children. It's a 1.5, 2-page document. Sometimes that's just you can send that to the school and be actually turns out this is the research. It's from CUNY. It's official. The City University of New York has a program that says this is really typical. There's also a review of the research from the American Medical Association that you could use if research is helpful in supporting. And you can also refer people to our workshops and our programs. We go into schools all around New York City and provide this ongoing professional development for all school-based staff, and we're happy to kind of support those conversations with schools.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So we have one more question. My son is visual and having a conversation is not ideal. What is an alternative?
Great. Let's brainstorm together. Does anything come to mind for you?
I think books. Books are a great way to have lots of visual interpretation, and some of the books that you were showing. I think it was the other one. This one. What Makes a Baby? It's very visual. It's very colorful. It's very it tells a story in itself. So you can show them the visual pictures, but then also provide a verbal description. But it's also kind of up to their interpretation, and no matter how much we explain it, they're kind of going to go on their own interpretation of it as it is. So I think maybe the books might be the best visual way.
Yeah. I wonder too, you've got me thinking you could kind of distill whatever the key points you're trying to get across are, and then make your own books using visuals and not words to kind of reinforce those key points. So maybe the key point is you don't have to hug everyone or kiss everyone, and you can kind of distill that down and either draw pictures or take pictures and create your own family books. That would be one idea.
Yeah, I think that's great. So we have...
Oh, and playing.
Yeah.
Playing is a great way, right?
Kids love playing.
Yeah, right? You can play, let's play the tickle game with red light, green light. So we'll tickle, 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 and then when I say red light, hands up, we stop, right?
That's a great
and
idea.
when you make it a game, you can actually practice those boundaries in a really fun way. That's not sitting down, we're going to read a book about consent today. You can incorporate them into your everyday life.
So we have one more question. before we end. My 9 years old son loves to hug people no matter who it is. How could I teach him the bad touching and the good touching hug?
Good question. So, bad touching and good touching hug. I think part of that is learning learning to pay attention to your own, like what feels right. We call it kind of your belly voice, right? And so if this hug feels good, then it's a good hug. If this hug is making you feel uncomfortable, then it's a bad hug.
Yeah.
And so talking about that difference.
Yeah. And the belly voice is like that feeling that you get in the middle of your stomach. It's kind of like your instinct. Whereas like even as adults, when we're doing something that we probably know we shouldn't, you get that weird feeling in your stomach. So it's pretty much the same thing for kids, and I think that's like a great example, Megan, using the belly voice to determine whether or not it's a good or a bad touch. One of the things that I do with Julian that actually works for us is he also likes to just hug people in the street. So one of the boundaries that I've made for him is if you know the person's name, then you can use their name to ask them if you can hug them. If you don't know their name, then maybe that means that you don't know them enough to hug them. So maybe you can start by asking their name and asking if it's okay for you to hug them. Usually it gets to the point where it's kind of like, once I ask him if he knows their name, he's just like, no. And he's like, all right, Mom, can I hug you? Yeah, of course you can hug me. But for us, it definitely is like that boundary that he knows. Okay, I can't hug everybody. And if I don't know your name, then that probably means like I definitely can't hug you.
Oh, that's super helpful. You've also got me thinking... it can be helpful to understand what's behind or like underneath your son's love to hug. Like, is it that he just really likes the feeling of an embrace? And in that case, like, how can you find opportunities for him to give healthy hugs to people who it makes sense and is appropriate to hug? Or is it he's just like really loving and trusting and wants to communicate with other people that he really likes them and likes being in their presence? And in that case, you might provide alternatives other than hugs to communicate that same message.
High fives work too. A lot of times we'll be in a street and he'll go to hug someone and I'm just like, I would prefer if he didn't hug you. Like he doesn't know you, he didn't ask your name, we didn't go through a routine. But he can definitely give you a high five. And he's as equally excited for a high five as he is a hug.
Cool.
So to me, it's just kind of like, okay.
Yeah. And I would say that book, Sex is a Funny Word, has a whole chapter around touching, and especially for a 9-year-old would be super appropriate. So I would definitely recommend this book.
Great. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out?
Just that I'm super grateful. I think parenting is like perhaps the most challenging job there is of all of the jobs. And it's not often that families just get recognized for like how difficult and important that work is. So thank you.
I usually say parenting is the most beautiful yet hardest thing that I have ever done. And for those of you parents out there, I'm pretty sure you can relate with me. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us. We've sent you a PowerPoint so you can review all of the information later or now if you want to keep learning and you're really into all of the stuff that we've talked about. And we've also included Megan's contact info, which Megan is always great about answering questions. Our next live stream will be on March 21st, where we will be discussing free assistive technology for everyday use at home, school, and in the workplace. I'd also like to remind you guys that you can check our website for upcoming events as well as past live stream topics. We also have all of our live streams listed on our YouTube channel. So we will see you at our next INCLUDEnyc Live, Real Conversations on Parenting and Disability. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.